All right, hello everyone, and welcome to tonight's lecture. Our talk today is going to be an introduction to the Terminal Classic and Post-Classic Maya periods. So tonight's lecture is part of the Huapahua Period America Lecture Series, which is a monthly series that promotes the study of North, South, and Central American cultures within the Greater SCA period. The lecture series is a continuation of the Huapahua New World Symposiums, which started back during the pandemic and have continued yearly for the last 5 years. The symposium over our lifetime has hosted over 40 instructors with over 700 students from every kingdom in the known world. So we're very happy with the success of the symposiums, and we're delighted to have everyone here for the new lecture series. So a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. So the lecture is being recorded, as you guys heard. We ask that you either raise your hand or wait for the instructor to call on you, or leave comments or questions in the chat so that the recording is nice and clean for those who aren't able to join us tonight. Secondly, in joining our lecture, you do agree to our zero tolerance policy for racism, xenophobia, colorism, and other forms of discrimination. If you have any concerns about any attendees, any lecture materials, etc., you can always feel safe in reaching out to me. My email address is going to be in the chat after I turn it over to our instructor. And then thirdly, we're always looking for additional instructors. So if you have a relevant course that you want to teach over the next couple of months, you can also reach out to me at that same email address. Again, it will be in the chat after I finish talking. And I'm also happy to let you all know that we already have our July and August lectures scheduled. Our July lecture is still being finalized, but that announcement will come shortly. Our August lecture will be on August 5th, and it will be on the topic of horses in South American culture. So time and additional class information will be announced and sent through our email blast and to all of our relevant Facebook links after this lecture. So I wanted to have a big welcome to Astrid. Welcome, and thank you so much for hosting today.
Hi. I can share my screen here. Yes. All right, can we all see this okay? Awesome, thank you. So, like I said, my name is Astrid Caisdottir, and I'm doing an overview of the Terminal Classic and Post-Classic Maya. Um, Big part of this is also the collapse of classical Maya civilization, so we're going to spend most of our time on that, and we'll be briefly with the post-classic afterwards. Big reason for that is the post-classic extends past the year 1600. Like some of the last Maya settlements to fall to the Spanish don't fall until about 1697. So plenty inspiration there already, right? Um, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. That if it runs over, that's okay. I don't mind sticking around for that. I do want to start though by saying that, generally speaking, content warning. There will be images of human remains. There's discussion of human sacrifice, including child sacrifice and the burial of children. So if those are things you're kind of squeamish about, you might not want to stick around for this one. The Maya do not shy away from depictions of death, dying, and just generally speaking, human remains. They don't shy away from our source, a little bit about me. Sorry, before we talk about my sources. I went to the University of Pittsburgh and I graduated my bachelor's in linguistics in 2021. From there, a couple of years later, I joined one of my professors, Dr. Claire Ebert, and I joined her field school for the Belize Valley Archaeological Reconnaissance Program in 2023. Um, Last year, I began conducting survey in the Humboldt-Toyabe National Forest as part of the Great Basin Institute, a kind of a partner with the United States Forest Service, and I haven't heard back yet, but I'm hoping to return this year. And then just earlier this year, I joined the Barony of the Cleflands, so I hail from Cleveland, Ohio. Go Midlands, Dracona Invictus. Our sources for today are the Maya, namely, this is the best and most approachable textbook, in my opinion. The Maya by Michael D. Coe and Stephen Houston. For our craftsmen, if you are going to purchase this book, and I highly recommend anybody interested in the Maya do, um, be sure you get the earliest I would get is the 10th edition. The 10th edition is the first one that's full color. So for our craftsmen, people that make ceramics, textiles, that kind of thing, um, if you want to be able to actually see the workmanship and see the colors and whatnot that they use for inspiration, be sure you get the 10th edition one. The other ones are mostly black and white. Additionally, we have lectures from Dr. Claire Ebert as part of my sources. I took a couple classes from her in the University of Pittsburgh. While I was part of BVAR, I had many lectures from Dr. Jaime Alwe from Northern Arizona University. If you're familiar with Maya archaeology, his name should ring a bell. He's one of the foremost authorities in the field. Excellent lecture and incredible soccer player. I mean, he's like middle aged and he's slide tackling me every time. It hurts a lot. Um, and then additionally, part of my excavation was led by Dr. Julie Hogarth from Baylor University. So her oversight and her constant stream of information was a huge part of my knowledge base as well. So I will stress by saying this then. A lot of this is from memory and site touring in addition to my sources. So sometimes a small detail might be wrong here or there. Just as it is, it's the cost of being an academic. Sometimes that's what happens is you just get stuff through the grapevine instead of, through books. So a lot of people who are familiar with the Maya probably know them for a few reasons. You probably know them for their, grand pyramids, such as this one on the left here from Tikal, right? Or you might know them for their beautiful, long spanning ceramic work. The famous comb vase from Baking Pot, right? Or you might even, if you know a little bit more about them, know that the reason why these pyramids got so big was that they would build them like Russian dolls. So they would build something on top of something else. So this pyramid here has, I want to say at minimum 12 other pyramids inside it. So if you went to the top floor and you dug straight down, you would dig back through time. You might even know that these pyramids never looked like this. They were painted with a limestone plaster, white, and painted red, like this image of the Rosalila structure in Copan, by this particular image is by Christopher Klein, the former art director for National Geographic. And this is about what this looked like. Inside of this structure, they dug through it and they found something that looked like this beautiful red plaster with these beautiful multicolored reliefs. There might have even been a little bit of Maya blue in there, but it might be a little too old for that. And we're talking about none of these things. In fact, what we're talking about could be best surmised by this image, because it's all going to hit the fan for us. So to start us off, I want to talk about the map of the Maya region. I have two maps here. The one on the left gives us a better idea of what the Maya cultural territory looked like. The Maya are not an empire. We certainly see, some kingdoms dominating neighbors, but a more accurate interpretation might be closer to the Holy Roman Empire. Um, a series of independent kingdoms, some of them spanning less than a mile, like a square mile. Some of them spanning as little as like a square kilometer. Um, in the south of the Maya territory, we have the Guatemalan highlands. So this is the absolute southern border of culturally Maya territory. Is the Maya highlands. You go north of that and you hit the Maya lowlands. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the the Maya lowlands pretty much encompass the rest of this. The Yucatan Maya, some people group them with the Maya lowlands, some people don't. For our purposes, we're going to, mostly because many of the sites and settlements that thrive in the north, that are said to thrive in the northern lowlands, end up being in the Yucatan Peninsula. Um, so that's kind of like the basis of it. But this map is not very all-encompassing. So our second map is, I wanted to give you a little bit of a better idea of what Maya population looked like. This is not an all-encompassing map either. This is not a perfect map with every single site on it. But look at how many settlements are in such a tiny space. Some of these are large too. Dr. Jaime Alwe once remarked during a lecture that he would often struggle sometimes to discern when one settlement stopped and another one began. If you're ever in like Xunantunich in Belize and you stand up atop El Castillo, you can see at minimum four other Maya kingdoms, neighboring ones, that are like less than a mile away. They are so tightly packed together. And that's important to understand what we're talking about. So the Terminal Classic is about from the year 800 to about 1000 AD, give or take, or 950 AD. It almost immediately opens up on the collapse of the Maya. Or the collapse of the classic Maya civilizations, rather. So, what are some of our themes of collapse here? So the biggest one is that it's the fall of the southern lowlands and kind of the pseudo rise of the northern lowlands, so to speak. A lot of the settlements during the Terminal Classic collapse. Some thrive. Most of them are in the northern lowlands. I don't want you to think of this as a geopolitical power shift. It's not. Rather, the cities that did well all happened to be in this particular area. In addition to that, they had the opportunity to maybe dominate some of their neighbors as well. And that helped contribute to their survival. It should also be noted, though, before we continue, that the Maya collapse has many varied opinions. About as many different opinions as there are Maya archaeologists. This is my personal take on it. From stitching together different sources, different lectures, kind of filtering out information as I went. Um, a lot of this is a product of the lectures that I had, but I felt like this was the most balanced and fair take. Some would say that I'm missing some key elements. Some would argue some of the elements we're going to talk about don't actually matter. It's a very convoluted and difficult topic. Moving on, one of the other factors that we see is overpopulation. The cities see consistent population growth up until the collapse, and then they see an almost dramatic decline. A big reason for that is periods of drought and ecological collapse. As we'll get into, the Maya staple crop is maize or corn, which takes a lot of water to grow. In addition to that, some of their farming methods were not the best for the environment. While they would often use step farming, some places early on used like a slash and burn, which really contributes to erosion. So your staple crop is something that takes a lot of water and can erode the landscape quickly, and then a drought happens. So we can already tell this is not going to go well for them. And the last reason is political breakdown, especially warfare. We will come to this on our own terms in a little bit, but the short of it is the face of warfare changed a little bit for the Maya. The Maya did not engage in what we call secular warfare. What do I mean by that? They very rarely fought wars over resources or with political rivals, so to speak. Rather, warfare is about maiming and taking captives and sacrificing them for the glory of the gods. So, very rarely do these tightly packed Maya settlements have defensive walls. You could just march right in there with an army if you wanted to and burn it, and the Spanish did. But they didn't need them, because why would you do that? That's not to say that cities weren't razed, weren't burned, weren't raided and the royal families, removed or killed. That did happen, but it's much rarer. But as the classic period trends into the terminal classic, starting around, 750, 800 AD, we start to see more of this. And all of these factors combined together. And it should be noted that different regions felt them differently. So obviously no one impact, no one impact is greater than the others, so to speak. And which ones were felt the greatest varied from city to city. Much like the Roman collapse, we can't pinpoint one's particular cause. It turns out human society is really complex, and to make one fall apart is just as complex. So I wouldn't be a University of Pittsburgh graduate if I didn't talk about drought. This is a big deal for some faculty there. So I better do them some justice. So like I said before, the Maya staple crop is maize, which takes a great deal of water. So when there is a drought, it's really felt on the population. There's multiple periods of drought that we know of. We know from the Maya records, these were mostly either one of four books, oral tradition, or what we call a stela, which is pretty much a big stone, not quite plaque, more like a plate that is incised and carved into, and they usually feature history. And we do know that from our analyses of these stelae that they very rarely contradict each other from one settlement to another. What was written down kind of depends. Sometimes it's only the matters of royals. Sometimes it's trades and wars and ball games. But what we do know is that it's almost never the mundane stuff. So when something is talking about a drought, a lot of the times our citation is they mentioned the drought because there was a large sacrifice made for rain. So between 820 and 860 AD, we know of a 40-year period drought. We know from a couple sources that apparently in the year 930, there was a particularly awful drought going on, but we don't quite know how long. Different stalagmite and stalactite data suggests that there's been multiple droughts that could have lasted from as few as 3 years to, in the case of the last one, 100 years, from 1000 to 1100 AD, there was a 100-year long drought. And of course, the impacts of this drought are going to be further exacerbated by overpopulation. So, in other words, with lacking food and having too many people, it's felt even more so, right? We do see some evidence of potential desperation here, namely increasing human sacrifices, increased sacrifices in general. We're probably all familiar with this image. This is the Crystal Maiden from Actun Tunichel McCall, or the Cave of the Crystal Sepulchra. It's a very famous cave. A lot of you probably know of it. Um, there's a lot of human remains inside that are kind of mineralized or almost crystallized because when it rains, the chamber that the sacrifices are in actually completely floods and washes it over with a bunch of limestone. So it crystallizes them. What's really important though is that if there's typical amounts of rainfall, you can't get to that chamber because it would have flooded over. I've actually been here before. This particular photo was taken by Dr. Jaime Alway, I believe. Um, it's a little hard to find a citation on that, but as far as I've only ever seen it attributed once. It was attributed to him. Having been inside the cave before, I've actually been there. The water would have been about to the ankles, is what the tour guide said, during a drought. And they said it was particularly low for us when we were there. It was up to my waist. I'm about 5'9". So to even get to this chamber, you have to actually like climb some other part of the cave and actually make a jump. You have to actually like jump to a separate platform in the cave to even get to here. So we see multiple sacrifices there. The Crystal Maiden, we actually don't know if he's male or female. We've seen both, but the truth is that because it's been washed over so many times, mineralized so many times, those sex-specific skeletal traits are obscured. What we do know is that they're about 16 to 17 years old, probably royal, and they're one of many children, ranging from potentially 2 to 3 years old to about 19. And then we also see some adults in their 40s and 50s. One of the big reasons why we might see increased desperation for sacrifices, though, is the way that Maya politics and royalty worked in interface with religion. So the king or queen, in some cases, is seen as the intermediary between the people and the gods. And that's why they lived on such a high temple, or a pyramid, sorry, because that was closer to where the gods were. So the king has to be the closest to the gods. So yes, there are priests and that have their own religious function. But at the end of the day, the person who's responsible for calling down, for really making sure that the rain gets called down, is the king. And he has to make sacrifices to do so. So if you're in a 40-year drought and you keep making sacrifices and nothing's coming, you're probably losing some amount of legitimacy, which might play into some of the political turmoil that we'll talk about next. Now, the last thing I want to discuss is the drought the distress the population generally felt, or is it the straw that broke the camel's back? So the real question here is all of this political unrest going on happening, and then there's a drought, or is the drought causing it? If you're familiar with like mathematical modeling of civil wars, you understand, grievance-based versus grievance-based theories versus opportunity-based theories. My apologies. What that means is your people have to be, does a civil war start because people are upset or because they see the opportunity to win? More often than not, it's because they see the opportunity to win. And as we'll talk about in a minute, many Maya cities, we find them with the reliefs of all of the kings scratched out. And we can pretty much date when the scratches were made in them, that they were made sometime in the Terminal Classic. So in some cases, maybe people rebelled against their king because he couldn't call down the rain. But the idea that I want to keep in the back of our mind is that there's many ways that drought could play a role, and we don't know for sure. So it's important to keep an open mind and not set into one particular interpretation because the face of Maya archaeology is ever changing. So this segues nicely into political turmoil. So the other thing that we start to see happen in the Terminal Classic at the same time is eroding political ties. So starting from around 750, and heading into 790, we start to see long-standing political alliances, like especially Tikal's many different alliances and Calic Mule's many different alliances start to break down. And with that, trade breaks down. And then the effects of prolonged warfare start to set in. So one of the big issues here is that the Maya had a very heavily interconnected trade network. We do know a little bit about the routes that somebody who's a trader might take. They basically take a canoe through one of the rivers out to the ocean, back up another river, and then walk the rest of the way. And that was your occupation. We do know that from the written Maya record. But um, if trade is breaking down, that's really bad because there's so many luxury goods that we see through trade. Some very far inland settlements have a shocking amount of seashells in them. Hmm. A shocking amount of coastal settlements have a lot of goods that you would not be able to find coastally, but you would find naturally occurring in the mainland further in. So we see this everywhere. I mean, we see ceramics travel from one end of the continent to the other. This just happens. So with trade breaking down, that's a big deal for the mine. The other issue that we start to see is monumental construction declines as death rates rise. So from 790 to about 830, and especially after 810, monumental construction just seems to stop across the board. There might be a few reasons for this. This is during one of those periods of drought, like we talked about. And the way that the Maya built these massive pyramids and buildings was with what we call corbe labor, a labor tax. You owe your ruler a certain number of days worked on construction projects every year. Well, it's really hard to convince somebody to do that during a drought, and it's really hard to justify pulling farmers away from their crops during a drought. So we start to see, we suspect that during drought, a lot of monumental construction stopped, and especially after 810, we start to see this become a big problem. Additionally, the Maya, of course, celebrates cycles, famously the Great Cycle that ended on December 12th, 20, right? So when you see this 10-3-0-0-0 date, think about that like year, month, day, so to speak, because in a way, those are cycles too, right? Now, granted, the Maya have about 5 different cycles going on, and they would celebrate when one of those ended, or rather when the new one began. So we would often see those dates inscribed on artifacts, things made in honor of the next cycle beginning. In 889, we only see that particular cycle celebrated in a couple of places. It's not very common. By 909, we've only ever found that twice. That doesn't mean only 2 places were celebrating it. That just means that we've only ever found it twice in comparison to the deluge of other things we found on other cycles. It's found once in a monument in Tonina, and then on pretty much an excised jade around Quintana Roo. That's it. So a big part of this is that scribal work is the work of the royals. Your general populace was not literate, and we'll get to that in a little. We'll get to that at the end when I show some artifacts that I've helped uncover before. But because that's the work of royals and there's political turmoil, there might not be a lot of people left to do that kind of scribal work. So in addition to the idea that maybe, this stuff wasn't being recorded, maybe it was still being celebrated, but not recorded. That might be an indicator of some great political unrest, if not even the royal scribes, whose job it is to just write things down and make ceramics, are no longer doing their job, as far as we can tell. The other big consequence of this is that sites get abandoned. Naturally, a lot of settlements, we stop seeing evidence of occupation beyond a certain point. And dramatically, we see the number of site abandonment go up in the Terminal Classic. Of course, there is some resettlement that happens centuries later, where smaller groups of people, this happens in Kahulpech, this happens in Shenantonich, this happens across the board in most cities. And if you had a population of 15,000, in a few generations, maybe a population of 100 to 500 came back and lived there in the place of their ancestors. And as I stated previously, the causes of all this are a little bit difficult. They focused on bigger picture events. The Maya didn't write about agricultural yields. They wrote about how this new king was crowned. They didn't write about how people left in droves. Droves because they were starving. They wrote about sacrifices made. So on a certain level, it's hard for us to piece together what's going on by the nature of Maya record keeping. Our last big cause is warfare. So, like I said before, previously in the classical period, secular warfare was an anomaly. It was usually used for captive taking, not necessarily over resources. We do see that still. We do see settlements that get razed to the ground, essentially, or as close as you can get with a limestone building, but not in the way that you might think of medieval European warfare. And as we also stated before, defensive settlements are very, very rare. But in the Terminal Classic, we start to see newly built walls. So we see settlements who have been standing for centuries. And then we start digging out the wall, and we realize the wall was built centuries after the rest of the settlement was built, which is a little bit weird if you're coming from the European side of things. Usually the first thing you built was your wall. For the Maya, it was one of the last things. It was only because they had to. In some places, the wall is even just poorly built or not finished because it would have had to have been so large that there was no way they were going to finish it in time. We also see more frequent evidence of burning. Most of the burnt pieces of settlements that we see were burnt. The carbon dating suggests that it was during the Terminal Classic. So we do see this increase in warfare, we think. We also see many cases stuff like items that would have been used for the royals out in the public plaza, smashed in the corner somewhere. That's how we found, the famous Combe vase that we talked about. That was in the public plaza of Baking Pot. That was not where that should have been, which would have been probably somewhere in the palace proper. We also see reliefs of rulers damaged or destroyed. Their eyes are cut out, their mouths are cut out, they're defaced. In some cases, the stelae, which would have announced when a new king was crowned, are completely smashed apart, and that would take a serious amount of effort to do. And in general, if there's all this warfare going on and there's a drought, the cities may have struggled to recover from this. Not just population wise, but also in general, constant warfare is a drag on society. And it gets hard to convince your populace to do a whole lot of things when you're constantly fighting wars with your neighbors. So let's put the factors together. So we have multiple interconnecting stressors in the Terminal Classic, and it would be possible to isolate any of them from each other. And like we said before, some locations definitely felt those factors more than others. Some people I have heard, some archaeologists posit that the Maya society was so interconnected that when one cog in the machine would fall, it creates a domino effect and the whole thing falls apart. The whole trade network, the whole political system, the whole geopolitical region completely falls apart. But it's not clear to me if that they were so connected that they were codependent upon each other. Um, Certainly some smaller settlements were codependent on larger ones. Some of the smaller neighbors of Tikal were codependent on Tikal. And we can say the same about Calic Mule. We can even say a little bit about Naranjo. But with the larger cities declining, then some of those smaller cities might have seen a power vacuum. They might have, if they were codependent, they would have most assuredly collapsed along with them. And given, the notion of the Maya, if you were going to dominate your neighbors, you would usually put somebody in that kingdom's court that could pretty much hold the family hostage, hold the royal family hostage. This is a setup for a really bad time geopolitically. We also think this probably resulted in some kind of migration. Maya oral tradition documents two different migrations, and also Mexican oral tradition, I believe, covers this as well. The Great Descent and the Lesser Descent. And both of those cover people from the south moving north. Now, granted, did people go further south into the highlands? Yes. And a couple of those cities did thrive. But much less so than two of the big players here. So, of course, not every city collapsed. Two of them in particular thrived. The first is Chichen Itza, and I know you've seen this pyramid before. Chichen Itza is a little weird. I could probably give a 2-hour lecture on just why Chichen Itza is so difficult to understand. But the short of it is that the Toltecs are a different cultural group. They're not necessarily Maya. They're kind of somewhere falling under the Mexican umbrella, as far as I'm aware. But what happens at Chichen Itza is that it has regular occupation, we think, dating back to the early classic. So about 250 AD. and probably even earlier, or it might be about 500 AD even, at its latest. But what happens is that essentially the Toltecs end up dominating Chichen Itza. There's actually like reliefs, like paintings inside the settlement of like the Toltecs in these war canoes, like going out and like landing on the shores of Chichen Itza and invading. And with like Maya war canoes sailing forth, so it kind of looks like D-Day, but with obsidian weaponry. Um, and the short of it is that Chichen Itza ends up thriving during this time. They dominate their neighbors a little bit, and they become one of the major players of the post-classic. Another good example is Xibal, or and the Putin Maya, or the Olmec Xcalanca, which is what the Aztecs called them. So Xibal is a settlement in Guatemala that was with the Putin Maya, but they had these almost like Mexicanized merchant warriors, is what they're called. The Aztecs called them the Olmeca Xcalanca, or Xcalanza, and they kind of end up dominating. In both cases, what happens is that this outside minority takes power, and they kind of have power in the settlement disproportionate to their population. In both of these cases, though, we actually see the introduction of Mexica deities into Maya worship. So we now have not just Maya deities, but we have, the Mexica rain god, who the Aztecs also worshipped. We see the sun god for them come up in a couple places, in addition to like principal bird deity from the Maya. Both of these settlements, I think, are in the northern lowlands. Chichen Itza definitely is. It's in the Yucatan. And we'll come back to the Itza in a little bit. They're big players in the post-classic as well. Um, and Xibal is found in Guatemala. So two settlements that did very, very well. Moving into the post-classic, however, so post the year 1000, Maya classical civilization has essentially, the Maya's classic period civilizations have pretty much collapsed by this point. Obviously, the Maya themselves did not disappear. They're still with us today. But what happens next? So in the post-classic, we have very few thriving cities, many of which are experiencing far more conflict than they did with their classical counterparts. Some major cities do get founded. Mayapan, for example, founded by the Itza, as far as we can tell, um, and how it actually came to dominate its neighbors, and how when they fell, they had a huge power vacuum as well. We also see this a little bit in the Terminal Classic. We also see this in the Post Classic. People returning to these classic period sites. Some of them lay sacrifices, often food, in the corners of the settlements. The corners of anything are sacred to the Maya, probably because it's a point of transition, much like much like the cycles of time. And there's also some stuff in the Popol Vuh about things being left in corners as well, the Maya creation myth. Um, we also see some people going back and laying people to rest inside buildings of these settlements. And we'll cover a little bit of some case examples there. Um, the other thing is that Maya religion prior to this appeared to be centered around like in public, like from kings, and now it's becoming a little more centralized inside homes, small shrines and settlements, and very small temples. Um, they feature both Maya and Mexican deities, which is a big deal because we don't see the Mexica deities prior to this. In Maya contexts, and now we do. And then we see some of this. We see that this era persists up into the Spanish conquest and continuing well into the Spanish conquest by potentially a century. I do, however, want to give us a word of warning before we continue here. So the post-classic lacks records. Like I said before, the Maya record keeping is done by royal scribes, whose job it is to do that. But there's no more royal families, really. As far as we can tell, there's not a whole lot of those, which means that a lot of this is now oral tradition and storytelling. So instead of having a record from that time period made in that time period, now our sources are looking back on the past. And that changes our perspective. Um, some of this oral tradition was recorded by the Spanish, especially Bishop Landa, but we have to be very careful when we're interpreting this because obviously the Spanish had their own reasons for being there. And they may have, elected to send some things back home to further back their cause, because it turns out they wanted to make money, and you need money to make money. So we better tell them what they want to hear to send us more supplies, right? Some Spanish sources are more impartial than others, but overall, they all do present, I don't want to say an agenda, but we have to understand who's writing them and where they're coming from in order to make good sense of this, regardless of their profoundness or perceived insightfulness. There's one particular anecdotal story that gets told sometimes that the Spanish are going through the jungle and they're going back to a city that they had been to, and they find two children who were crucified there. And they go, I thought we told them to stop doing child sacrifice. So they go over there and they ask, hey, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? You can't sacrifice children. And the Maya king looks at him and goes, what do you mean? Your God sacrificed his son, didn't he? Isn't that what we're supposed to do? Did you say to be like him? Whether or not that's true or not, remains to be seen. But this is a story that comes from the Spanish. And while it might sound very profound, we have no idea whether this actually happened or how that would benefit the Spanish's goals. So we have to be really careful with these. Other stuff that we see, like I said before, this oral tradition is also used as evidence in modern courts for indigenous land rights, especially by Maya that were displaced by the Maya genocide during the Guatemalan Civil War. So we're dealing with evidence that has a massive amount of legal precedence, and there's a great deal of indigenous rights that fall upon these. So we have to be very, very careful with how we interpret stuff from the post-classic, because it could have ramifications well outside academia. I'm only going to talk about one settlement from the post-classic here, and that's the Mayapan. So Mayapan is founded by the Itza in the Yucatan sometime between 1263 and 1283. And the Itza, it's not really clear. While the Maya may have accepted the Toltecs to an extent, everybody hates the Itza for some reason. Some things that they call the Itza are foreigners, tricksters and rascals, the lewd ones, and people without fathers or mothers. So Gen Alpha, be proud, motherless and fatherless behavior is a timeless insult. Um, what we do know is that the Mayapan doesn't become a real player until about 1283. Um, and we have these exact dates from Stela and the Maya long count calendar, of course. They have very exact record keeping. The earliest start to the Maya long count is like 3114 BC or something crazy like that. So the fact that we know down to the day from their records is pretty impressive. Um, they ascend into geopolitical power, and they take over pretty much the entire Yucatan Peninsula from the Maya. And the way that they do this is after their rise to power, they start dominating their neighbors by pretty much holding the royal families hostage. They send people there to watch over and make sure we're benefiting each other mutually, which is to say, you're giving me large amounts of money. And if you don't, I'll kill you, is really what the Mayan are doing here. Some point to linguistics for evidence as well that the Mayapan dominated most of the Yucatan Peninsula. Yucatec Maya is very homogenous. If you look at a linguistic map of Mayan, most of those territories or most of those like areas where they're spoken and where they come from are very small. And then, a little bit here, a little bit here. And then like Yucatec is like this. Like it's like the whole map. So some people like to think that maybe an example of why, or sorry, an evidence backing, sorry, that the Mayapan dominated like all 16 of their neighbors or something like that is because the language remained unchanging. Now, granted, linguistics actually kind of disagrees with that notion that purely politics can bind a people together. A good example of this would be like, say, modern China has many different languages spoken, many different forms of Chinese spoken, but they really push Mandarin. And there's a political reason for that, but that doesn't extinguish these other languages from being spoken. So I have some trouble believing that this is really evidence for that. But some people point to this. The other thing about Mayapan that's a little bit weird is it's not built like other settlements. Many settlements are built with the cosmos in mind. The Maya are very symbolic. So nothing in Maya mythology, nothing in Maya city planning, civics planning, etc., is by accident. The Mayapan has no roads. which is already a little weird for a Maya city. They also don't have like any real civic planning, like all of this, like they do for like their monumental architecture. But then everybody else just kind of like picked a plot of land and said, "Oh, I live here now." With their own little personal property wall and a little bit of farming land and that kind of stuff, but not like any other settlement. So what happens with Mayapan? So Mayapan, thrives for about 200, 300 years, dominating its allies. And again, we don't have a lot of history here. It's really hard for us to tell because there's less members of the Stela cult. We're also looking into the past. We don't have a record in situ, so to speak. So sometime around 1441 to 1461, a 20-year span, which means that the record says during this cycle, this happened. Some say that Hunakchil, the last ruler of Mayapan, used some sorcery to make the ruler of Chichen Itza, so their neighbors, Chakshib, Chak, to kidnap the bride of a neighboring kingdom's ruler. And then, which results in pretty much that kingdom saying, "What are you doing? Give me my wife back." And they invade Chichen Itza and they kick the Itza out. At the same time this happens, though, the Shu, or the Chu, it's kind of hard for me to pronounce that, I'm sorry. A new Mexican lineage ends up rebelling against the current ruling family, the Kokon. And then the Maya nobility, who don't like the Itza at all, in Mayapan, back the Chu. And then they put the entire Kokon line to death. And then they immediately abandon the city entirely. So they say. We're actually completely unable to prove if any of this is true. Again, our sources for this oral tradition are the Spanish. So the Spanish, might have some reasons to be truthful in their recording, and they might have some reasons to not be so truthful. It's also true that in this time period, the Maya had made some adjustments to how they saw lineage work, or how they saw lineages, to benefit themselves, because they recognize that this is coming after a collapse. So it's a little bit every man for themselves, maybe. What we do know is that the Mayapan thrived in the 1200s and 1300s, but it experienced multiple periods of warfare. There's multiple times we see Mayapan is burned. We see multiple times, we see multiple mass burials for people that seem to have suffered battle wounds. We see a lot of evidence of turmoil here. More importantly, however, is that the time period lines up such that Mayapan would have fallen while the Aztecs are making their big power grabs, which might point us towards some broader regional instability happening in the region at this time. Now, we're going to talk about a couple of case studies. This is stuff that I saw while I was being an excavator. Or rather things that I was told that our lecturers and the people leading our excavations saw. So this is Cajolpech. Cajolpech is in Belize. It's in the Cayo district, close to San Ignacio. This is a place I've actually been to. I've seen this map before. This is the actual state park archaeological reserve map. And north faces this way, right? There's two important things I want to talk about here: resettlement and sacrifices from within, or sacrifices from those people to their ancestors. So, one of the things that Dr. Jaime Awe, who did pretty much all of the excavation here, discusses is, I want to say it's back here, and it's either in Plaza C or it's here. He was doing an excavation, he was doing some work, and he noticed a line of bricks, limestone bricks, going like this, next to the ball court, somewhere around either here or here, because the ball court's part of this. And he goes, "Well, that's really weird." And he starts looking around, and he's starting to find evidence of things like fire pits. Well, that's kind of weird. And what are these post-classic ceramics doing here? This doesn't make any sense. So he keeps sticking around, and eventually what he figures out is he found evidence that people, well after Cajolpech had been abandoned in the Terminal Classic, so this could have been a few generations later, this could have been centuries later, came back to the city, a very small population, about 100 people maybe, and lived here in the place of their ancestors. And we see this in a couple other settlements. Like we do see this in smaller settlements around Belize. Presumably, we see similar stuff in Guatemala. Believe it or not, the modern Maya still practice this. There is one day a year set aside in the state park of Tikal, Guatemala, for the Maya to come and leave burnt offerings to their ancestors. For the modern Maya to do that, because this was the place of our ancestors, so it's sacred. Now, if we're looking at this site map here, so this is how we know that east is here because these were the three pyramids that royal barrows would have been in, and you believed that the spirit of the kings reincarnated with every sunrise. So you put their burials the most eastward that you could. We go into the royal palace, Plaza A. The plazas are places where royals would have lived, so to speak, when they're part of the palace. So like Plaza A, Plaza D, Plaza E, those are places where the royals lived. Plaza C, Plaza F, Plaza G, probably not so much, but possibly. It's been a little while since I've been there, so I would really need to look at the buildings real closely again, but I believe like these were steam baths. I believe B5 is a steam bath, actually. And you had almost like apartments for the royals. So your lowest plaza was stuff like the scribal intern, essentially. There's a particularly humorous Maya ceramic that features a the head scribe of some kingdom yelling at his students for doing such a terrible job. So, but we do know that they were royal in order to be in that place. Still, they were considered royal. So this might be where they lived. You might have some like really low end bureaucrats that handle only like very local things. And this might be where you would meet foreign diplomats. And then like if you go to Plaza D, you have some, higher level stuff. This guy's boss, the intern's boss, and then his boss is in Plaza E, stuff like that. Um, Somewhere I want to say it's in Plaza A. I think it's either around A2 or A3, building A2 or building A3. Jaime was doing an excavation and he noticed that on the benches of the beds, so the way that these rooms were was that you would walk in and you had a corbel vaulted ceiling if you had a ceiling at all. Oftentimes you had to like lay a textile over top of it to keep the rain out. What would you have, a place to step into, and then to your left or to your right is a large stone, like I don't even want to call it a block because it's so huge. Your whole family slept on that, and that was your home. If you weren't royal, you lived in like thatch huts or stuff like that, dotting around the immediate area of the settlement. There's a stone plate on top of one of these. Well, that's a little strange. Why would you need to do that? And so they pull the plate off, and there's a circular hole cut into the bench. That's weird. It's filled with dirt. And they start pulling the dirt out, and they pull out the remains of a 9-year-old, of what they suspect is about a 9-year-old child. With it, grave goods, marking the child as a prince or the line of royalty. And this isn't the first kind of burial that we see like this. It turns out many Maya settlements have these terminal classic and post-classic burials, where when somebody would die, sometimes their loved ones would bury them in the place of their ancestors. In this case, this is one of the examples that we see that because we don't know when this was, we know it's after the collapse because you probably would not put a dead body in a place people were still living. That doesn't make a lot of sense to do, especially if what do you sleep there? That's a little gross. Um, but we suspect that this was probably people that might have resettled here. Maybe it's part of that, or somebody later. But the remaining thing is that, from as near as we can tell, whoever left this settlement, they kept track generations after of who their king really was, which I think is really notable and says a lot about the Maya. This isn't the only place we see this, and this might not be Cajalpech either. It might be a different settlement Jaime excavated, but it's not the first time that we've seen this, and this is a pattern that we see with this kind of resettlement, these much, much smaller populations resettling these places to be closer to their ancestors. Now, this is part of an excavation I did. I can't tell you where this is. I'm not allowed to. This place is not open to the public yet. However, part of my excavation, these are both the same unit. So as we can see here, this is a layer of rubble. We look right here. I'm hoping you guys can see my mouse. my mouse cursor. If we look right on the right side of this left photo, we can see these stacked stones. Those are stairs. Awesome, we can see it. Good. That's what we want to see. Looks like stairs. And look, all of this stuff, these are all cut stones. If you look real carefully, they're all cut, but they're all over the place. We're right next to a building. This is rubble. This building had already started. This building has fallen apart, and then the dirt covered it up. So it fell apart well before it got buried, like well before natural forces, bury things. These stacked stones here, those are the edge of a stairway, we suspect, or we suspected. I think we later confirmed that's what that was. So we start pulling away the rubble. And then this picture on the right, this is about right here in this photo. Um, that's the base of a ceramic and the shards of it. And there were more. There's about 4 or 5, I want to say. The Maya would often leave offerings of like food and whatnot to their ancestors, or like ceramics where they make like a kill hole in them, so to speak, that you've probably heard of, where they would like drill a tiny hole to release the spirit of it, and then place it down and leave it in the corners of the settlement. So this is not unheard of. We find this, we document it really, really thoroughly, as we always do, and then we pull up the ceramics to another layer of rubble. What? Rubble, artifact, rubble. This artifact was placed on top of rubble. This building was already falling apart when this was left here. This building was already crumbling. In other words, it may be a little bit fantastical to put it, but this place was ancient history to the people making the sacrifice. um, and this isn't the first time we see this. Other settlements did this too, where they would leave offerings to the crumbling in the corners of these crumbling buildings, and then the building would crumble more and cover it up. People were coming back here well after the settlement had stopped being cared for. Like, this is dilapidated. This place is falling apart. It's a ghost town. There's nobody here to take care of it anymore. And they're coming back to leave offerings to their ancestors. Also in this unit, I was unable to find a picture. Unfortunately, when I got my new cell phone, I lost many photos I had of my particular excavations. But we also found a projectile point, and it looked to be more like an arrowhead than a dart. And that's a big deal because the Maya don't adopt the bow and arrow until well after the Terminal Classic. They don't adopt it until the Post Classic. Some people argue that they actually had it in the late Classic, but the evidence, in my opinion, does not add up to anything that's substantial, and it seems more like they're talking themselves in circles. Just my opinion on it. So indicating that, but this is a Classic era settlement. What's an arrowhead during it? That's technology that's out of time. People came back, probably came back, and may have lived here. We didn't find a lot of evidence to suggest that they had resettled in this particular area, but there's only so much a, 3 by 8 hole can tell you, right? Um, my last photo here, this is a piece of a ceramic that was uncovered in this area. Look, this has a glyph laid on it. And to show you kind of the state of some of the arts, I wanted to talk about this real quick. The Maya did not have pottery wheels. They used coiling. So they would, heat the clay into these strands, and then they would lay the strands down. You could do a similar thing with like pasta noodles. You take it and you lay it down, make a circle, and then you put another one on top of that. That's what that would look like. Well, the Maya figured out, because again, writing, nobody's literate except the royals. So stuff with writing on it is a luxury good, a high-end good. Well, at some point in the late classic or the post classic, they figure out that you can make a mold and essentially take your hot clay vase and roll it across it to like basically make this kind of imprint. And that's what they do. So they pretty much start mass producing these luxury goods in a funny way, or what makes it look like a luxury good, but it's for the common man. Now, how do we know this? Because the writing on them is total gibberish. It doesn't mean anything. It's completely incomprehensible. In some cases, they make up new glyphs like that never existed before, and they put it on there because they go, "Oh yeah, that looks right, sure." Um, so this is what we suspect was a piece of some of that. We did find a few pieces of these. Unfortunately, I have lost those. But I wanted to show some evidence of that, to show at least, like, appeal to some of our craftsmen here because I understand a lot of the people that take on these indigenous personas are really big on the craftsmanship. I wanted to show a little bit of that and at least give you something. And that's all I have. Do we have any questions? Um, Anything like that? I know that was a very quick and brief overview. There's a lot to cover there. I just covered enough content that was like almost half of a semester for me. Any like general questions? Yes, Jam, Jesse, my wife. I don't know if she had a question or not. She gave me the thumbs up. Anyone at all? Any about anything with the mind? Did they prepare for droughts in any way? So that's hard to say. Um, like I said before, they didn't really talk about that kind of stuff. They didn't talk about like the civic side of thing. We actually know next to nothing in art or record is about the common man. I would say that did they prepare for droughts in any way? It's hard to say. You know, did they eat through all their food stores in the dry season? Probably not. These places lasted centuries, some of them millennia, some of them over 1,000 years of people living there in constant occupation. So probably yes, in some way. Spiritually, they definitely did. They were well aware of the dangers of drought. Um, Sacrifices, in some places, child sacrifice is a big deal to them as well. We do see. Good question, though. Excellent question. Anybody else? No? All right, then. Thank you very much for having me. I hope I did my background some justice. Thank you, everybody.
Absolutely. That was so much fun. Thank you so much for coming out and teaching with us. Hopefully, everyone had a good time. This video, like I said, was recorded. So we should have videos coming up for you in the next couple of days. If you want to be notified about our upcoming classes, or if you want to be notified when the video is active, you can put your email address in the chat right now, and I'll add you to our email blast list. I promise I don't spam you or give your information to anyone. You just get one helpful reminder every month letting you know when the next lecture series class is taking place and when new videos are available. Thank you guys all for coming, and I'll keep the chat open or the room open for a few more minutes if anybody has any questions that they didn't want to put on video, or if you want to put your email address in the chat. Thanks so much.